After giving us an amazing inside look at flying the F-15E Strike Eagle and how its presence in Saudi Arabia has evolved, Richard Crandall is back. This time he paints an awesomely in-depth picture of what it was like strapping into the cockpit of the legendary F-111 Aardvark during the tumultuous final decade of the Cold War. Joining the F-111 family. I asked for F-15s, F-16s, F-4s, F-111s, or a 10s on my dream sheet. I then called to change the order to put a 10s over F-111s. The assignment guy at Randolph told me not to worry about it, as a classmate had put F-111s first. In fact, his father had died flying the F-111 in Vietnam. Took off and was never heard from again. He got the F-111. Well, we both got F-111s and I got the second. I was not thrilled, but I sucked it up and got to it. I went to Holloman AFB for lead-in fighter training, lift, in the T-38B Talon. I loved the training. I loved the air-to-air sorties and did okay at it. Sadly, the F-111 was lousy at air-to-air. It had way too high a wing loading, poor visibility, and huge energy bleed-off when turning. It was almost impossible to get above 5 Gs in it, and when you did, you had just lost about 200 plus knots in the brake turn. Oh well. From Holloman, I went to Canon AFB to fly the F-111D model. The F-111A model first went to Vietnam in 1968 but was withdrawn quickly after 3 crashes. It returned in 1972 and was very successful. It was named Whispering Death by the North Vietnamese. Most of the US pilots called it the Vark, short for its name, Aardvark. The Aussies called it Pig, which was fitting, as its air-to-air maneuverability was that of a fat pig. The A model had an all-analog cockpit. The weapons system officer, WSO, had to twist dials to change the latitude and longitude to the next coordinate. The pilot would turn to the next heading and hack a watch, or use a running time, while the WSO would change the inertial navigation system, INS, coordinates and then make sure the computed heading/time agreed with the dead reckoning time. All F-111 pilots lived by their stopwatch. You could not fly without it, as the INS died young. The F-111B model for the Navy was canceled. Too big, too heavy, and not maneuverable. They got the Tomcat instead. Face it, Tom Cruise in an F-111 just wouldn't have hacked it for a movie. The Tomcat was a good choice on their part. The F-111C was for the Aussies. It was an F-111A with 3-foot longer wings on each side for better range. Strategic Air Command used the same long wings in the FB-111. It had slightly less allowed G loading, but that wasn't a big deal as we didn't pull a lot of Gs very often. The F-111D model was radical. It had a glass cockpit. This included a multifunction monochrome TV for the pilot and a much bigger one for the WSO. It also had digital computers with a tape to preload a planned route. It was a paper tape with holes in it, on a reel, no kidding, but it worked, eventually. The D model had 2 terrain-following radars, TFRs, built by Texas Instruments, just like all the other F-111s, but it could use the transmitter/receiver from one TFR to power the attack radar up to a range of 20 nanometers. We used that feature a lot, and it was a great benefit, as the attack radar often failed. It also had a great Doppler navigation system tied into the INS. This was awesome for over-water flight to keep the INS on track. This was a very difficult system to maintain, and eventually it was canned. It also had a moving map, which was great, but of course that, too, was difficult to maintain and eventually canned in the 80s. The truth is that the D model didn't work. They parked every single one of them in Fort Worth for several years as they worked to fix the bugs. Meanwhile, they built the F-111E, which was basically an F-111A with bigger air inlets. It was all analog, just like the A model, but it worked. They then built the F model, which was the Cadillac of the F-111 Force. It had huge engines and could even go slightly better than 1-to-1 thrust-to-weight ratio when almost dry and without stores. It was fast and digital, but not as integrated and as fancy as the D model. No multifunction displays, but it did have digital computers. Eventually, they put the PaveTac laser targeting system into the F-111F and it carried it internally, which was much better and had less drag than on the F-4, where it was called pave drag. The F model was most famous for the raid on Gaddafi. Really low and really fast. The F-111 worked in Vietnam because it flew really low and was really fast. It could fly down to 200 feet AGL above ground level using terrain-following radar in all but the heaviest rain. As long as the TFR could see the difference between the weather and the ground, it could fly safely. The Vietnamese would barely hear it coming as it was pushing the Mach and was really low, hence the nickname. That tactic, low and fast, became the doctrine until the third night of Desert Storm. The phrases speed is life, one pass, haul ass, and you do more than one pass in a target area you die all came from Vietnam. The radar was the best in the fighter world at the time. An F-111 WSO would use the Great Real Beam map from the radar to update the INS and navigate, but also clear the terrain ahead of the jet. If an aircraft is below a mountain peak, the shadow behind the peak diverges. If an airplane is above a peak, the shadow converges. Thus, the WSO would clear out to much farther range than the pilot could see on his display. The pilot had a logarithmic presentation of the ground that was weird. Level ground would start high on the far right at the greatest range displayed, and then curve down and left in a sort of parabolic curve. The first half of the scope, from left to the center, was 1 mile. The next half of the scope, from the center to 3/4, was another mile. Then, from 3/4 to 7/8 of the display was another mile. From 7/8 to 15/16 was another mile, until finally hitting 10 miles at the far right edge of the display. Thus, the pilot could see terrain fairly clearly from the nose to about 3 miles or so. After that, it all tended to blend in.